welcome back to the Mainstream. John, really good to be back with you. Have you got a big announcement that you've just joined One Nation and you're going to be a candidate at the next election? When's that all happening?
That's not happening, Dan, but do you have an announcement that you'll be running for leader of the South Australian Liberals after they're reduced to a couple of seats?
Well, you've got to be in Parliament first, John, by convention, so that's probably unlikely. I think.
Getting to Parliament's traditionally been my problem.
There's always next time, John. There's always One Nation. There's always next time. So lots to talk about as we kick off the year, the rupturing of the coalition, the Liberal Party. Is the Liberal Party actually a centre-right party anymore?
Does it have a future?
The rise of One Nation, the hate crime laws, which we're going to drill into because everybody knows they're really bad, but you are only going to hear about the actual legislation and stepping through just how bad these laws really are. And also some summer reading, some light summer reading you've been reading at the beach.
Inspirational summer reading that I can't wait to talk about.
But let's kick off with the topic that everyone is aware of at the moment, which is One Nation's rise, the Liberal Party's fall. We all know that One Nation's at 25% primary, Liberals are about 20% primary vote. But you've been looking at some polling that actually goes through a little bit more detail that hasn't been explored or dissected in the media, that's very revealing about who's voting for One Nation and why they're doing it.
So, Dan, as you said, the polling from Redbridge, a Labor-aligned polling firm, that with the result published in the Financial Review at the beginning of the parliamentary sitting week, of course, identified that One Nation first preferences indicated by voters is 26% compared to the ALP's 34%. The big news, of course, was that One Nation is on 26%. Coalition is on 19. So that's had a lot of publicity, and it's given further cause to the rupturing of the coalition. And what do the National Party do, and what do the Liberals Party do? What do the Liberals do in response to One Nation? Very significantly, when you look at the data behind that, you see a couple of things. The first thing that you see is that broken up by age group, the age group roughly 46 to the age of 60, which is Generation X, 12% of that generation say they'll give their first preference to the coalition. 35% say they'll give their first preference to One Nation, and 33% ALP. So let's repeat that. 46 to 61, Generation X, 12% say they will vote coalition. So the first thing that occurs to me is that people have said the coalition has a young person problem, which it does, because only 15% of those under the age of about 30 will vote coalition. But the single biggest age cohort that is not supporting the coalition, that the coalition has succeeded in turning off, is that Generation X, those in their 40s, those in their 50s. I theorise that it's that generation that understand how good Australia once was, who understand how good Australia can be, who understand that Australia is missing opportunity after opportunity. And this is the generation, and this has been talked about a little bit, that has ageing parents and relatives to look after. Mm-hmm. It has children at school or children entering the workforce. They know that their children are not going to be able to afford a house. They know they're coming away with massive debt if they've been at university and they've learned nothing. And these are people who realise the system is broken. That is hugely significant. The coalition is failing at every other age group, and the coalition, for example, is trailing 21 to 35 against One Nation for the over 60s. But this is a dramatic change, and even if One Nation, as has been talked about, doesn't poll quite as well at the next federal election as the polls are currently indicating, this is a breaking of the traditional constituency of not just the coalition, but specifically of the Liberal Party. This is huge news.
It is. And it's not they don't have a young people problem, they have an all people problem. Everybody is turned off from the Liberals. No one votes for them anymore. And I think the thing that came to mind when you mentioned that to me is you mentioned like the sandwich generation, as they call them, like kids and parents. So you're sort of stuck in the middle. So you're probably a bit burnt out, a bit run down. You've been the backbone of the nation. You've been working your whole life. You're paying taxes. You're taking care of your kids. You're taking care of your family. You're doing what else you can to volunteer and help out. And then you sort of come up for air because you've had your head down working hard, and you realise what happened to my country. Like I don't. The word
I don't recognise it anymore.
Alienated
at every level, and that's been expressed in cultural terms, but also in economic terms. The idea was once that you could create a business, that you wouldn't be regulated to death, that the money you earned you could keep, that your superannuation wasn't going to be changed every 5 minutes, that you could invest knowing that the framework will provide you some economic security for the future. All of that's gone, in addition to the fact that your child is going to school and being told there are dozens of different genders. And by the way, the Prime Minister doesn't even like the country that he's leading.
And won't stand in front of its flag.
Exactly.
Either. And then you mentioned also in terms of, I don't think the poll does a deep dive into demographics, but you can look at the educational breakdown, which is a proxy it's a proxy for many things, including your economic class circumstances, if you want to put that frame on it, but also probably your cultural values and views as well.
Exactly. So this poll doesn't break up voting intention by income, but it does by age, as we've talked about, and also education and also home ownership. So if we take education as a proxy for class division to some extent, those who have an education of less than year 12, 35% support One Nation. Those who have a TAFE or trade qualification, the backbone of Australia, the mainstream, 33% support One Nation. One Nation is the most supported party amongst that group. And again, as to be expected, if you have a university degree, you are going to overwhelmingly support the Labor Party, and that's where One Nation's support is less. What this indicates is...
It was 15% or something.
It was 15. If you have a university degree, it's 15%. Your first preference votes to One Nation. What this indicates to me is the class... I'm going to go a bit Marxist now, Dan. The class divide in Australia. And you look at this, and all the discussion has been that the right is fracturing and splitting up. I'm not sure now that is the case. The difference is not between the left and the right. The difference between the parties is between the insiders and the outsiders, the somewheres and the anywheres, which we could talk about
which was
in a moment.
David Goodhart, the UK.
Yeah, so, and his argument, of course, was that the elites could be anywhere. They believe in a global economy, a global culture. They're not particularly committed to their community or their history or their culture or necessarily even their family, because they will be travelling the world to get a high-paying, high-prestigious job, compared to the somewheres who are grounded in their community, who care, who for a variety of reasons will live probably close to where they grew up. They're living close to their relatives, and they're committed to the nation state and the community and some identity. And that is now the gap. And you look at this and you think, well, in the last 10, 15, even 20 years, has the Liberal Party actually been a centre-right party? To describe it as centre-right might not be accurate, because it's difficult to think of many centre-right things the Liberal Party has either done in government or supported in opposition. And it's much easier to think about all the things they've opposed, and we'll come to freedom of speech in a moment. But it is the case that the One Nation vote reflects that difference between the insiders, the elites, the parties of advantage, the parties of influence, and then the rest of the country of voters who just want to be heard, who haven't had a fair go, who don't believe they've had a fair go, and who are disparaged and looked down upon at every opportunity. And these are the Trump voters, these are the Farage voters, these are the Maloney voters. And it's always been argued that none of that's going to happen to Australia. Well, it is happening right now.
Hi, thanks for watching. Did you know that 3/4 of you watching this podcast aren't currently subscribed to the IPA's YouTube channel? So do us a favour, hit subscribe, and you won't miss any of the action. While you're at it, head to ipa.org.au, Follow the prompts to subscribe to the IPA's website so that way you'll find all of our research and analysis. Now back to the chat.
But you mentioned, and I think this is true too, that politicians were shocked by these poll results. Should we go into hate crime legislation? Do you want to talk about your time in Canberra and what you learned before we go through? And I printed off all 55 pages. I've tagged it and highlighted the key sections to explain to people exactly what our politicians have just done to us. But do you want to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go into the details of the legislation?
Yeah, let's do that. So the hate crime legislation that was passed a couple of weeks ago, as I wrote in my correspondence to IPA members and has been more broadly broadcast, was diabolically bad. There were two parts of the original laws, which was the hate group. Well, there were several parts, but there were two egregious parts. There were the hate group laws and then the racial vilification proposal. Now, the racial vilification proposal was removed, and yes, it's true that the Liberal Party played an important role in getting rid of that part of the legislation.
And that was to basically make racial vilification, however defined, a crime.
Yes.
Punishable by imprisonment.
Jail, yep. But the
outrageous.
Outrageous.
Yeah.
The hate group legislation passed with the support of the Liberal Party.
Equally outrageous.
Although there were, in the Senate, Alex Antic was the only Liberal to vote no, and there were more Liberals to abstain than vote yes, which is good. But the Liberal Party still supported it in the lower house.
And we'll come to the role of the important and noble actions of the Nationals.
Yes.
We'll come to that.
But in terms of the law, so we were myself and Morgan and Margaret were in Canberra briefing MPs. We talked
on our research.
Yeah, we talked to dozens of MPs about this. And before we get into the actual details of it, what struck me was that they really struggled to get a hold of what was happening. They were sort of captured by...
What do you mean what was happening?
They were captured by the circumstances that they found themselves in. So it wasn't clear why Susan Lee had said Albanese must recall Parliament, we must go back to Canberra after Bondi. There was a feeling that because of that demand, because Albanese said, yeah, sure, because he knew it was an out, that they had to agree to something. They had to get a compromise on something. And the prevailing mentality and psychology was, we just have to do a deal to get out of here. And you can understand the mindset, which is the leadership has stuffed this. We've cooked the whole thing. Let's just do a deal that basically their view was the legislation will have no practical impact because we're just mirroring terrorist legislation. We'll just say we're banning Hizb-ut-Tahrir and neo-Nazis. Get out of it as a 0-0 draw, and then we
can say we've done something following Bondi.
Yeah, and then we can reset. So they were all focused. They all had the legislation going through, or what safeguards can we have, and et cetera, and completely missed the bigger picture that this legislation, the response to Bondi, people in the community know it is disgusting and pathetic. And they know Anthony Albanese is a Labor political warrior. That's all he does is the politics, day in, day out. They know the problem is mass migration underpinned by multiculturalism. They know that guns aren't the problem. They know that hate speech is not the problem. And they know that we have pathetic, weak, cowardly politicians on both sides that refuse to speak the truth. Everybody in the community knows that. It is not difficult to understand this, but they get captivated by these Canberra games that are so removed from reality of what's happening. All they had to do is stand up and say, this thing is a cop-out. We're not playing this game with Anthony Albanese.
These laws will be manipulated. They will be weaponised against mainstream Australians, as we'll talk about. These laws are not the answer. They don't combat anti-Semitism, and they don't combat the anti-Semitism that the Labor Party has allowed to fester in this country.
And there were a lot of MPs that we met with that were genuinely doing their best to try and get through it. And they understood the whole thing was terrible and the party's going down. They are, I don't doubt their motivations a lot of the time in trying to figure out a way through. It's just that I guess when you're in the middle of it, you don't always see the forest for the trees, and it went careening. You could just see it careening off the hill.
So there's two things I want to just unpack with you. One is I want to put on the record, and I've written about this as many people have, the outrageous manner in which this was debated and presented, asking people to vote. The initial bill was some 150 pages. This legislation has passed, it's 50-odd pages. Dramatic, significant legislation. I think Matt Canavan said it's one of the most important pieces of legislation he's ever voted on, and he voted no, to his great credit. But this was pushed through in 24 hours in Parliament. It was negotiated in secret between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. I don't think there's anything that I would agree with David Pocock on, the independent senator from the ACT, other than when he put out a tweet saying, "It is unbelievable that I'm expecting to vote on this significant piece of legislation when I've had a couple of hours to read it." So that's the first massive failure of
you could vote
of Labor and the coalition.
The no vote should have occurred on process alone.
Well, yes,
if nothing else. That's
yes.
sufficient. Like, you can't put this through in 2 hours.
And we could talk about this. I had a friend ring me up the other day and said he was talking to me about politics, and he said, you couldn't support. He's a good guy, centre right guy, by and large, freedom loving by and large, and he said, this One Nation vote, I just can't understand it. It's absolutely alarming. You couldn't support anything that One Nation do. And I said, I could. I absolutely could, on the issues important to me of freedom of speech, freedom of religion. One Nation have been there. No one else has been, and I said exactly what you just said. One Nation called out this absolute failure process. The Liberals didn't. So you want me to explain why I have an understanding for why One Nation is becoming popular? Well, because they're standing up for values that no other party stands up for. So that's the first reason. And then do you want to talk about the fact that you were surprised, that the politicians were surprised by the outrage? Yeah,
well, we've seen a lot of pushback from, not the entire, there's a lot of people that still don't know about this, but there's a cohort that I call kind of like marginally attached to politics. So these are people, you probably have mates that are sort of, they kind of know about politics, they're sort of interested in it, but they've got busy lives. But the online world has allowed them to be engaged, because it only takes 5 minutes. You go through social media and you see what the issue is. So they're sort of interested, but they're not deeply informed of issues. So it's that cohort of people that it penetrated out to. And the pushback was palpable and significant and immediate and fierce, particularly against Liberal MPs who were trying to justify their position on social media. Many of them got a lot of pushback in
comments.
In comments, like a lot of pushback.
Thousands of comments.
There were, and they did not expect this to happen for a couple of reasons. One is that it was summer, Australia Day, school holidays, people aren't tuned on. Maybe that's true, but I think people are still on their phones and stuff, so I don't know whether that's true anymore. The other thing is, it's kind of like, we'll just say we're doing it for national security reasons and we're banning Hizb ut-Tahrir and neo-Nazis, and then people will go, okay, well...
People will believe us. We just say, it's in the name of national security.
Yeah, and it's not, because, as we'll talk about, Hizb ut-Tahrir and neo-Nazis have not been banned by the legislation.
Yeah.
No one has been banned. Yeah. So it was untrue. But also, the problem that they had was they went in so hard in saying we're not supporting Labor's legislation, and then they supported it. Now, yes, it is true that they removed the racial vilification.
There were two terrible parts of it.
They got rid of the racial vilification.
Got rid of one terrible part.
Yeah, and they would, I don't know what was negotiated, but they would argue they made the hate group stuff less bad. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not.
It would have been pretty bad before the Liberals got their hands on it.
But if we give a charitable view, let's say that they made it less bad, but they didn't explain it. Yeah. They just said, we're not voting for this, and 3 days later we said I voted for it. You have to actually tell people what's going on in the middle there, at a minimum, to dignify them with an explanation. And many of them just said, I will just tell them. And it's fine. And I know for a fact they weren't expecting it. I know for a fact that they were angry. A lot of them were angry at the pushback. But at the end of the day, people, and you might comment on because you have a long history with your leadership on freedom of speech, in particular Section 18C. And I just think the debate about these issues and community concern has dramatically shifted from 10 odd years ago, where free speech was seen as a bit of a journalistic class bubble thing, which was, well, I don't like that journalists are getting shut down, but I'm not shut down.
It'll never happen to me.
Yeah, but now everyone sees what's happening in the UK and Europe, and they go, it's happening here in Australia. I don't want this to happen.
Yeah, so I'm tremendously heartened. We'll talk about the legislation, which I think is incredibly dangerous, and we want to talk about heroes like Lou O'Brien, the Nationals MP, and what he said about it, but I'm tremendously heartened by the response. And for me, it's interesting that politicians, Labor and Liberal, have been talking about the need to engage with communities, use the online community. Many MPs have been doing that successfully. And then when someone tells them on online media that I disagree with you or you've done something wrong, they get upset and angry. But I'm tremendously heartened by the response and by the pushback. And I think you're dead right to examine the last 10 years. When the IPA first started talking about Section 18C and Andrew Bolt was prosecuted under it, and to remind listeners and viewers what Section 18C is, was passed by the Labor Party in 1995. It's a section of the Racial Discrimination Act, and it makes it unlawful to offend, insult, intimidate or humiliate someone according to their race. And there are some defences, but as judicial decisions have made clear, those defences usually don't apply. They're not allowed to be applied. 10 years ago, people thought we had freedom of speech in Australia. What's happened since? We've had lockdowns. We've had censorship. We've had the misinformation laws attempted to be passed by Labor, supported by the Liberal Party. Exactly as you've said, we've seen Australians are very aware of what's happening in Europe. They have seen and are starting to permeate that laws like Section 18C, and we'll come to this hate speech legislation, don't just affect high-profile cases of people who want to make themselves political heroes either of the left or the right. It affects mainstream Australians, and I wrote about this in my Financial Review column last week. 18C that no one had ever heard of. It was a obscure piece of legislation and had been sitting on the books for 10 years until it was used against Andrew Bolt and then Bill Leak. Was used against run-of-the-mill Australian students who were studying at QUT, and you can watch a video that the IPA made on this some 10 years ago at the time of the case, who walked into a computer lab and were asked to leave because the lab was reserved for Indigenous students. They went back and they wrote on the university's Facebook page, they wrote messages against racism. They said, and famously one of them said, QUT are stopping segregation with segregation. So they were arguing against racial division. They were arguing for equality, and they were prosecuted under Section 18C through civil action. Some students paid money. Eventually, the final group of students were sued for $250,000, and the case was dismissed after it went all the way to the federal court, after they received pro bono support through great people and lawyers like Tony Morris, and you can argue whether their lives were ruined. Some of those students would say their lives were ruined. You could absolutely say their lives were turned upside down by these laws that no one knew existed. And Australians are waking up. Australians never would have thought that a pregnant mother would be arrested by 4 or 5 Victoria police in her living room for saying that lockdowns were wrong and that there should be a protest about it, when, as we found out later after the charges were withdrawn, what she said was legal. People would never have thought that we would have in Victoria, or Australia broadly, the two-tier justice, the two-tier administration of the laws. So, for example, if you thought lockdowns were a bad idea and that Dan Andrews was destroying your life, the Victoria Police would not allow you to protest. If you thought that we should protest about Black Lives Matter, and that was an important issue, the Victoria Police would allow you to protest. So they're seeing not only the enforcement and the weaponization of laws, but they're seeing that the administration of justice is now at 2 levels. If you have a view that agrees with the ruling regime, you won't be prosecuted. You will be allowed to protest. You can go to your heart's content. But if you are a dissenter, if you are a heretic, if you are a dissident, if you vary from the line of the elites and of the political class, you will have the full force of law directed against you. And what is so disappointing about the reaction from so many coalition MPs who supported this legislation is none of them understand that. None of them. Only a couple of Nats and One Nation do.
You mentioned, you mentioned Lou O'Brien, and I just want to give context to Lou O'Brien, because he's a backbench MP that some may not have heard of, but he represents Wide Bay in Queensland, which takes in, I think it's north of Sunshine Coast, takes in like Gympie and Noosa and places around there. So he said, I think it was just a day or two ago, that he threatened to quit the Nationals if the coalition, so he's in the LNP but sits in the Nationals party room, if the coalition, whatever kind of plan is put together to bring the coalition back together, doesn't include a plan to repeal these hate group laws. So you'd have to think that he's leaving and presumably joining One Nation, I assume. And also I mentioned Colin Boyce, who's the member for Flynn in northern Queensland. He did an interview the other day saying that the rise of One Nation will create massive problems for the National Party. And this is the key point: the wider public are sick to death of the current government and the coalition opposition that we have got. So there's a lot of movement happening, and these hate speech laws, hate group laws, have been sort of an impetus for what is happening now. They're a cause and a symptom of the deeper problem. We've been teasing a bit about the law, so let's get in.
Let's get into it. And again,
let's get into the actual hate crime laws.
And this is the frustration of the media and of the debate. And this is one of the things that social media does allow you to do, which is it does allow you to investigate things for yourself and make up your own mind. The Canberra Press Gallery has been so focused on the day-to-day politics of what Susan Lee says to David Littleproud and the ins and outs of the coalition, which frankly is irrelevant into the medium term, that there's been almost no discussion of the contents of the legislation. The media have just accepted the assurances of the Labor Party and of the Liberal Party that this is just run-of-the-mill national security legislation. It absolutely is not. One Nation know this, the Greens for their reasons know this, the IPA knows this, Lou O'Brien knows this, Colin Boyce knows this, Matt Canavan knows this, Alex Anditch knows this, but most of our mainstream politicians don't. So as you said initially, there was 150 pages of draft legislation which Labor presented 2 weeks ago in response to Bondi, which related to gun laws, which related to aspects of migration, making racial vilification a crime. That was taken out. And then also creating new powers that allow the government to criminalise groups that promote hate and engage in hate crimes. So the law is Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism, Criminal and Migration Laws 2026. Of course, it's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And we were told by the Liberal MPs voting for this that this law, as you said, bans neo-Nazis and Hezbollah Tahrir. No, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. So the first point to make is that the hate groups legislation has as its purpose, and we need to remember that the purpose or the objects of an act as stated in the legislation are important, because in questions of ambiguity or uncertainty, when the courts interpret the law, they interpret the law subject to the objects of the law that Parliament says is important. So we now have an act that says the purpose of this law is to protect the Australian community or part of the Australian community against social, economic, psychological and physical harm. There's other aspects to it, but that's the first section. Now, that gives the Australian government massive power to control what we say and what we do. As Matt Canavan said, given that the government now has the power to regulate the causing of economic harm, if he was to organise an economic boycott, let's say, of the Russian government, would that fall foul of this? So that's the object of the Act. There's a number of definitions of what a hate crime is. We won't go through all of them, but the key and most problematic definition of a hate crime is hate crime is conduct or a threat of conduct that creates a serious risk to the health or safety of a section of the public if that act is motivated by race, national or ethnic origin. So a hate crime is now not anything to do with violence. It's not anything to do with the intimidation of a person physically. It is a hate crime is now the creation of a serious risk to the health or safety of a section of the public or a targeted person. So we now have a new precedent that a crime is a hate crime is something that affects the health and safety of a person. So if you do that, and if you're the member of a group, the Minister for Home Affairs, if they are satisfied on reasonable grounds, whatever those reasonable grounds might be, that minister can prohibit you and declare the group that you are part of as a prohibited hate group if the minister believes it is reasonably necessary to protect the Australian community or parts of the community against the harm that's just been identified. So that's the first part. So you've got a hate crime, and the minister can ban the group if the group does a hate crime. Key point, Dan, before we go to questions is that, and again, this takes 10 minutes of explanation, but it's not that complicated. The minister can define a group as a hate crime group, even though a hate crime has not yet been committed.
Yeah. They just have to believe.
Yeah. A person does not need to have been convicted of a hate crime in order for the minister to be satisfied that the organisation has engaged in a hate crime.
That's a pre-crime.
So that's a pre-crime.
So the other thing that's explicitly stated is, as you say, the hate crimes don't have to have occurred. No conviction of a crime is required, and the minister is not required to observe any requirements of procedural fairness.
So do you trust... So again, first question, do you trust Tony Burke?
I don't trust anyone.
Do you trust any minister with these powers?
No.
Okay, so so that's the process before... This is the final part of the legislation.
Yep.
Before the minister can then ban a group, and we'll look at the consequences of membership of a banned group, they need to receive advice from the head of the security agencies, the Director General, and the Director General only has to be satisfied that the activities have taken place and that those activities would or, and this is the key part, would or are likely to increase the risk of politically motivated violence or the promotion of communal violence.
Yes.
So let's unpack what that means.
Yep. Well, there's key satisfied.
Yep.
He just has to be satisfied. That is an incredibly low threshold. There's nothing in the legislation that requires the head of ASIO to explain to the community how he reached that view.
They don't. It's specifically specified that they don't have to follow procedural fairness.
It talks about increased risk. So the risk could be very, very, very small. It could be 0.0001%, but it's a slight increase in the risk. And what people of politically motivated violence. Now, the other point here, and this is a point that you made that no one else has picked up on, which is that most people would assume that it's the group itself that is promoted, that is the risk. So say you have a new group that forms in society and it is a hate group that's going to go out there and cause violence. That's the group that they're targeting. But that's not the case. All that has to happen is the activities of a group increase the risk of politically motivated violence, which means that you could form a group that might be, say...
completely pacifist.
Or opposed to...
Do not engage in violence at all.
But someone else doesn't like the group and they organise a violent reaction to that group. Technically speaking, the formation of the pacifist group has increased the risk because the risk wasn't there before the group started. So the Director General of ASIO can say, no, hang on, if that anti-migration group sets up and goes for a march on Sydney Harbour, that's going to provoke actions from this other section of society. Therefore, I'm banning that group, not the ones that are reacting to it. And this is the point, a lot of Jewish organisations supported these laws. It can be used against them. If they want to go on a march or a protest about...
to defend the actions of the IDF, I think we know, or we can sadly...
They would not be allowed to do that.
I think we can sadly suspect what will be the response.
They would be banned.
To a march supporting the IDF through the streets of Melbourne or Sydney.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, one of the claims... So one of the so-called...
But the point here is one other point on the ASIO, it's a political appointee.
I was going to make... Yeah.
So we're told...
I was going to say, yes, the Liberals have said... as we reached out to them and I was talking to the MPs, they said, no, but, the Director General will have to be satisfied, and that's a pretty high bar.
Unreal. I mean,
the Director General is a political appointment. They're a public servant.
But the other thing about a safeguard, right, is a safeguard has to be independent of the executive government. Otherwise, it's not a safeguard. The whole point of checks and balances is you have things in the system that are independent of one another. If the executive government appoints this person, it's not a safeguard. Even if you love this person, even if you love ASIO, just on the basic political side, it is not a safeguard. It is not a check and balance on the use of power.
And David Spears again said to Matt Canavan on 7:30 on the ABC. He said, well, "I think it was. Do you trust
me then, David Spears?
do you something like do you trust ASIO?" And Matt Canavan came back to discussing the legislation. The point is not do you trust ASIO today or tomorrow. You may trust this current appointee or the next appointee. Do we trust an ASIO appointee in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time? The point about Section 18C was that it was passed in 1995. It wasn't criminalised and weaponised really until 10, 15 years later. The Liberal Party, again, in its desperate attempt to tell people that there was nothing to be worried about in this legislation, said, no, look, one of these safeguards is we have to be the leader of the opposition has to be consulted.
Yeah, so this is sort of step. So step one is Home Affairs Minister basically says it's a hate group.
Yeah.
Step two, it was not quite clear this is how, but
that's how it would operate. Yeah.
The other step is ASIO has to say yes.
Yeah, and then the Liberals said, and the opposition leader has to be consulted. Okay, so that assumes the opposition leader might be Liberal. Well, they might be Liberal. They could be One Nation. They could be the Greens. So the Labor minister consults with the Greens leader of the opposition. But they don't even consult. The actual legislation
a briefing.
Says that before a group can be banned, the minister, this is ridiculous. So for anyone who wants the reference, it's section 114A.6b. The minister must arrange for the leader of the opposition in the House of Representatives to be briefed in relation to the proposed regulation.
Yeah.
Such is where my liberties go to die.
But don't worry, John. There's step 4, which is that the Attorney General must also be consulted. But don't worry, the Attorney General is only a member of the government, so that'll be fine.
What is the penalty for all of this? So there's various penalties for organising a hate group, being a member of a hate group if you know it's a hate group. Another penalty is that a person who's committed an offence, if they're a member of this group, the group is a prohibited hate group, as we've outlined, and the person is reckless as to whether the organisation is a prohibited hate group. So you might not get on the internet and find whether the group that I'm going to march with or hold up a placard with is a prohibited hate group. If you're reckless and it's a hate group, you're imprisoned for up to 10 years. And
there's nothing you can do about it.
So let's unpack this again, as we've been explaining to the public. Let's give this a real-life case study, a real-life scenario. There'll be Black Lives Matter protests into the future. There have been Black Lives Matter protests in the past. And by the way, these laws are retrospective too. If someone goes to a Black Lives Matter protest and holds up a sign saying, all lives matter, let's say 3 of you do that as a group, you could be committing a hate crime. The group of the 3 of you who believe in racial equality, who believe that all lives matter regardless of the background of the person, could be defined as a hate group. That's one specific example. Let's go back to 2023. During the Voice referendum, many of the no arguments were criticised and attacked as being expressions of hate. So this is not hypothetical. This actually happened. So, for example, in the Conversation website, September 4, 2023, a number of university academics, including the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney, said that many of the claims made by the No Group were hateful and were hate speech. So the title of the article was How Hate Speech During the Voice Campaign Can Harm Personal Wellbeing as Well as Democracy. So a group that organises to...
Having a debate is bad for democracy.
To argue for racial equality, for civic equality, who believes that we are all equal regardless of our background or our race, could very easily be defined as a hate group. So this is what we now have. And here's the kicker. Here's the kicker again. I don't know whether any Liberal MPs read this or not. A bit surprised if even Labor MPs read this. So if you go to, this is my favourite perhaps, Section 114B.7, General Defences. It is not an offence against this division to do either of the following: to do a thing in accordance with an arrangement or agreement to which the Commonwealth is a party, or to perform an official duty or function for the Commonwealth, a state or a territory. So what does that mean?
Well, no, I was just thinking about that. So that sounds like a technical legal thing. But when you think about it, a Commonwealth, what was it? Commonwealth entity. So that would include, I assume, the ABC.
Yep.
So the ABC would be, on my reading, and I'm not a lawyer, but on a plain reading of that, the ABC is a Commonwealth entity. It's solely funded by the Commonwealth government.
Yeah, the Commonwealth is a party to...
The ABC by virtue of its funding. It would be exempt, but Sky News would not.
So Sky News can commit a hate crime, but the ABC
and they
can't.
could both. So you could have a guest on ABC, and a guest, same person, says the same thing as a part of a group on the ABC and on Sky, and Sky News can be a hate organisation, I assume. Or if a Sky News presenter says it, maybe it's more of a presenter as a part of the group, or an ABC presenter could say it, and ABC's fine, Sky News is a hate group.
So, and it doesn't even
provided those other
it doesn't have to be Sky News. It can be anyone running an organisation. And the point of this is it's retrospective. So there is now the potential for the state to go back through history, whether you've run a podcast, whether you've run an online journal, whether you've run a community newspaper, you could be retrospectively guilty of a hate crime. The chilling effect of this is enormous, and it's an absolute condemnation of anyone involved in the passage of this legislation, but so especially of the Australian media that is so concerned allegedly about our rights that as yet there has not been a thoroughgoing examination of any of this. And Dan, sadly, as I say so often on this podcast, there's nothing I agree with the Greens on, except the Greens for their own reasons, because they want to keep on saying what they've been saying. But their point is not wrong, that there's been no discussion about this. None. And then politicians get upset when they're inundated by thousands of emails and texts saying, you've taken away my freedoms, and you've taken away my freedoms after you've said you wouldn't.
There's just two other things that they claim just quickly as safeguards. So one is a review of the listing of a group.
Right.
Has to be undertaken by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. So that's just a review. It can't stop a listing of a hate group.
So the Liberals could have pushed for a sunset clause, for example, but they didn't.
Yes.
Or maybe they did, but it didn't go through.
Yeah. Sunset clause meaning that the legislation automatically expires.
Yeah.
There's only one actual safeguard in here, which is that the listing, so Tony Burke and that can say, we're listing this group, but Parliament can disallow that listing, which is a genuine safeguard because, again, it's independent of the executive government.
No, it's not a safeguard if the two major parties agree. They have waved this through. Sorry.
I was going to get to that. I was going to say it is a genuine safeguard in like a legislative sense because it's independent of the executive government. But of course, what the disallowance allows for is only a majority of one of the houses has to say no. Now, obviously, the lower house won't do that because Labor has the lower house.
Or the government of the day will have the lower house.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
And the Senate could do it, but the Senate just voted for these laws.
Yeah.
So it is the only hope we have is the Senate might come to its senses to say, look, we're not listing that group. But that is the only thin, if you're listed as a hate group, that is the only thin chance that you have is the Senate would have a majority that disallow it. And you're basically relying on the Greens to go with you on it because obviously Labor will support it.
Many Liberals MPs said they were shocked by the responses we've talked about. They were taken aback and they said, oh, no, we had to vote for this because otherwise we would have got something worse. Well, no, there's no evidence of that. They said the Greens would have done a deal. Well, the Greens opposed this part of the legislation anyway, so there's no evidence of that. And what about the power of saying no and standing on principles? And what about doing Lou O'Brien and saying, vote for us and we will repeal this law that affects everyone? And it was misinformation that so many Liberal MPs engaged in when they said this is about terrorism. This is about extremism. No, it's not.
Yeah. I mean, the issue with the legislation among all this that we've talked about is it doesn't do what they said it would do, which is ban Hizb ut-Tahrir and neo-Nazis.
Which they could have done. They could have just named
them.
Named it. Well, they have sufficient power under legislation anyway, and there's something upwards of a dozen terrorist groups that have already been banned.
Yeah. So when they say, I voted for this to ban Hizb ut-Tahrir, well, you didn't because Hizb ut-Tahrir are not named in there. Now, maybe... you can say, well, Tony Burke has the power to ban them. Yeah, he does. Will he ban them? Maybe he will. Will he ban other groups? Probably. Do you have any control over that? No. So you voted to give the Labor government at the height of its power and at the lowest depths of your power unprecedented control over national debate. Now,
on national debate about the key touchstone, which is race, culture, immigration, social cohesion, the number one issue that has dominated the Australian public discourse is now to be controlled by the Minister for Home Affairs.
Yep. You mentioned before.
So the only question that for me is how come One Nation is only polling 33%?
Yeah. 20 years at 25, 33 amongst some. It's 25.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
But yeah, you're right.
Yeah, sorry. Why is One Nation only? Sorry. 20. Yeah, I was. I was getting hopeful. No. Why is One Nation only polling 26%?
Yeah.
Yeah, no. When 60% of Australians voted no to the Voice. When One Nation starts polling closer to 60%, I'll start to get excited.
Yeah. Well, 72% of tradies voted no as well. Like Absolutely. If you go by that breakdown as well that you had. You mentioned before compromise and not compromising, and that sort of dovetails into your light summer reading that you've done on abolition.
Well, I think we've had a really good discussion, Dan, about compromise, about standing on principles. And over summer, I read a wonderful book, William Lloyd Garrison and the Abolition of Slavery, All on Fire by Henry Mayer, an American academic who's no longer with us. I think when was this published? This came out in 1998. And the best part of summer is reading big books. So William Lloyd Garrison lived 1805 to 1879, was a Christian, and he was an abolitionist. He was committed to abolishing the evils of slavery, and he's famous for many things, including being the editor of a weekly newspaper, The Liberator, which he published from 1831 to 1865, 1,803 editions. And in it, he argued, and he started in 1831, so 35 years roughly before the end of slavery in America. And he argued a few things. He argued that slavery is morally wrong. He argued that anyone who compromises with slavery is guilty of a sin. He argued for immediatism, which is no negotiation, no compromise, no discussion. We're not going to say slavery can be abolished next year or next century, or as happened in America when a slave turns 18 or 21 or 35. He said, no, it must be abolished immediately. It is an evil. Significantly, he also said that politics is not the answer to the end of slavery. He said slavery has to be changed in people's hearts. There has to be a moral argument for slavery. So very importantly, and this was a big debate in the abolitionist movement, he said, look, politicians lie, they compromise. Politics is a business of compromise. There can be no compromise. We have to change people's hearts and people's culture before politics happens. And he was described as a crank. He was described as someone who was unrealistic. He was described as someone who just didn't understand the day-to-day realities of politics. But, the power of William Lloyd Garrison is that, ultimately he won. And there was some, wonderful lines. There was a journalist who went to visit him in 1845 as Garrison was coming to the height of his influence. And at the time, there was only the circulation of the Liberator was only 2,000 or 3,000, but it was hugely influential because he never compromised. And this journalist said that Garrison was unwilling to engage in the popular American practice of splitting the difference and playing politics. And famously, he split with Frederick Douglass, who we've spoken about, who argued that, in fact, the only way to end slavery is through politics. So it's an inspirational book. There's so much to learn from the life of someone like William Lloyd Garrison, and he famously said, for change, agitate, 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 no matter what was said about him. And there's just so much to take from the life of someone like Garrison. And of course, what we're debating in Australia is not anything on the scale that he fought against. But there's lots of lessons, and all the arguments that we have about politicians letting us down and why won't they listen and why won't they understand what they're doing, he was going through 200 years ago. Wonderful book. I really enjoyed it.
You probably need both, don't you? Your Garrisons and your Douglasses. Because at the end of the day, you need to win the hearts and minds, but you also need a legislative outcome. So you are going to need legislators to get an outcome at some point. But is the point basically that they're just going to do it because of the overwhelming public sentiment? So it doesn't matter who's in there, they will do it because they have to.
Politics is down. I mean, this is a manifestation of Breitbart's politics is downstream of culture. And it's interesting. So Lincoln is Republican nominee in 1860. He didn't really support Lincoln because Lincoln was not an abolitionist. And he said Lincoln's not a bad person, but if Lincoln is going to do anything, we are going to have to get him to do it kicking and screaming. We're going to have to petition. We're going to have to let people know how we feel. And there's some fascinating background on the famous gag laws because, of course, the US Congress prevented petitions against slavery being heard in the representatives, and John Quincy Adams, the former president, fought against that. There's a lot of discussion about freedom of speech in this. So, of course, in a number of southern states, it was a crime to argue for abolition. It was a crime to even have a copy of the Liberator. And he said, but if we're going to get politicians to do anything, we're going to have to force them to do it because there's very few politicians who do anything from the goodness of their heart or because they think it's the right thing to do.
Well, some things never change, hey? All right, thanks for sharing that with us, John. We'll leave it on that note today and catch up in a couple of weeks.